Welcome back to the Raising Rock podcast. I am Elise and I am your host. Today on the podcast, we have Tricia Scribner from Dr. Nana Talks Faith. She also does a lot of work with Mama Bear Apologetics, and you guessed it, this is an apologetics episode, which I am so excited about. It's something that I have been wanting to dig into a while. In my adult life, I was only exposed to apologetics maybe 10 years ago. And it's something that has really deepened my faith and my belief and my convictions in the authority and accuracy and legitimacy of the Bible and everything in the Bible. And something that I have been knowing I need to start talking about with my kids. And so we really dig into what is apologetics, why is it important, and we cover some pretty big topics. What is truth and how do we know it exists? How do we know God exists? Who is God? And whether or not Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead. So we cover some pretty foundational topics to our beliefs as Christians in a way that is easy to explain to our children, again, to help them understand and own and believe their faith, and to not just believe it because we believe it, but to understand the why behind it, which we get into why that's so important in our culture, because it is really important in our culture in the day that we live in. So I can't wait for you to hear about this episode and to hear everything that Tricia covers. You will be blessed. Take out a pen and paper and jot down some of the things that she says and gives us as word tracks, because they are so practical and so useful as we go and have these conversations with our children. But before you do that, or maybe while you're doing that and looking for your pen and paper or the notes on your iPhone, go ahead, pause this episode, like, follow, subscribe. Everything you're doing with engaging with our content is so helpful and so useful. We are gaining a new audience day by day, and it's all because of the way you guys are engaging with the podcast. So it really is going a long way in helping us become more discoverable to a new audience, book new guests, become legitimate in the eyes of the podcast world, which really does help us bring in the guests that you guys are wanting to hear from. So thank you if you have done that. If you haven't, please do so. We are so appreciative of you being here. And with that, Tricia, welcome to the Raising Rock podcast. Tricia, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So thankful you're here. This is a conversation that I have been so excited. I don't know if excited is the right word to use, but just full of anticipation maybe would be the right way to phrase it and put it together. I have two boys, 6 and 9. And my youngest is a little prayer warrior and is all in and prays all the time. And it is just such a heartfelt relationship with the Lord. My oldest wrestles a little bit more. He loves the Lord. He believes that Jesus died on the cross for his sins. All of that is there. But he really is one that has to understand the why, the how. He wants to go deep into theology. He asked me a year ago, he's like, can we study Revelation? I want to really understand Revelation. I was like, whoa, okay. So that's just how his brain works. He is hungry for knowledge, wrestles with answers that he's given. And if he can sense at all that an answer to one of his questions isn't backed with facts, he pushes. And he has to understand the why, the how, and all of that. And so I'm so excited. You're the first guest that I've had on that specializes in apologetics. So maybe take a second, introduce yourself, tell us what apologetics is and why it's something that's important to start with our children from a young age.
When I was growing up in the 60s, we never debated about whether truth existed. I remember having an argument with another 10-year-old friend who was Church of Christ and I was Baptist about what was required for salvation, okay? And I insisted, by grace through faith alone, she insisted water baptism was required. We argued back and forth about this until my mom had to come out and calm things down. Now, those kinds of arguments don't occur as much anymore in the general culture. Never once when I was arguing about whether baptism was required for salvation did I doubt that truth even existed. It never would have occurred to us to talk about that, and yet that's where we are today. And so apologetics is offering evidences for the Christian faith. And I learned how to do that in a systematic and logical way with the philosophical underpinnings, which feels overwhelming to a lot of people. But remember, we can't be expert in everything. If I want to understand more about my bank statement or how to figure out something financially, I'm not the person to come to. I go to somebody else. My husband is an expert in that area. I ask him. He understands spreadsheets. I don't. So let's remember that each person is gifted. But what we do need to have, even if we're not an expert in this arena, of offering defenses for the Christian faith and being able to explain why we believe what we believe. We do need to have a working knowledge because of what our kids and we are now facing, which are issues that we didn't even deal with in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. And so this is where apologetics becomes a useful tool. We often call it a pre-evangelistic tool, but it's integrated right into the evangelistic conversation. Your older son who is asking, but what about? He's going to be the apologist in your family, because these are the kids who raise these questions that nobody their age is usually raising. The doubting, yeah, but what about? Yeah, but, over and over, who if they don't get their answers and have someone who can talk with them about this, they deconstruct or they never come to Christ at all. And so we can do something about this as Christian parents, and we want to put the tools in your hands at Mama Bear Apologetics in order to equip your kids and equip yourself. Because like I said, some of us didn't grow up when these kinds of questions were at issue, and we can. And one of the most foundational ones is going to be, what is truth and how do we know it exists? That's the foundation for everything else, because otherwise we can't evaluate any other truth claim unless there's such a thing as truth. If we can just get blown off by, well, maybe that's true for you, then we go nowhere. So these kinds of issues are ones that apologetics tools can help us with and give us tools to equip our kids. And we don't have to sit down and do a dissertation with them. We can integrate it into our regular life, but we've got to read some, we've got to watch some podcasts like this and start getting familiar with the language, and that apologetics isn't being defensive, but it's giving reasons what your oldest son is asking. But what about, but I need the facts behind that. I want the evidence, but could it be that? And understanding how to think critically about truth claims that are being made within our society and not among non-Christians, and to deal with our own questions and doubts.
I was 27 years old the first time I ever heard an apologist speak. So someone came to our church about 10 years ago, and it was the first time that apologetics had been introduced into my atmosphere. I didn't know the term. I had never heard it before. And it's become fascinating for me as an adult, because I was one of those people that I was born and raised in church. I believed because I believed because that's what my family did. And it wasn't until adulthood that I embraced my relationship with the Lord for me, because it was what I was choosing to do, and the Lord got a hold of my heart and all of that. And so I was just not introduced or aware of apologetics until much later in life. And I feel like that's probably fairly common. It's similar to what you said, of it just wasn't part of like your atmosphere when you were growing up. So for those listening that are like, yeah, great, my kid, they go to church, they've said the sinner's prayer, they believe in Jesus, we pray, we read our Bible, they're not asking questions. I'm going to just skip this episode. I don't feel the need to dig into apologetics. Do you feel like this is something that every parent should care about, or just the parent whose child is showing interest in asking deeper questions?
Let me tell you that if your kid's not asking the question, they may think they already have the answer. And if they didn't get it from you, they got it from somewhere else. So this is a big issue. Hillary brings this up in the first Mama Bear book that she wrote. And that is, it's very possible that if you're not careful by beginning to explain to them, what truth is and how we know it exists, that in their postmodern mindset where truth is relative, subjective, you decide what it is for yourself, and if you feel that you're a man in a woman's body, then that's your truth. Everyone else must respect it and affirm it as also true. When you say in those conditions and in that kind of cultural situation, Christianity is true, your kids may be mentally, automatically adding the phrase "for you" on the end of it. Christianity is true for you. They may nod in agreement. They may not ask questions. They are just quite content with something being true for you that is not true for them. Now, I'm not talking about facts about reality being different for each person, that you have on a red shirt and I have on a blue shirt. Nobody disagrees with that. But when we say a truth about a thing in reality, and we say that my perceptions determine it instead of the object, then that is relative and subjective. Therefore, it is changeable, and it can be whatever I define it as, and it puts me as God over myself. So this is the culture that our kids grow up in. And it's automatically ingrained, and it's taught to them and absorbed by them, even though it may not be said, there's no such thing as truth. They may never have heard that phrase, there's no such thing as truth. But it is steeped in our culture, our politics, our cartoons, our social media, and the social peer group. So these are natural to our culture now. And unless we recognize this and accept it, embrace it, and go with it and begin to analyze and look at things, asking ourselves, is that claiming subjective truth or objective truth? We're going to get sucked in. And we should not be surprised then when our young adult comes to us and said, that's great if it's true for you. Or that's great if Christianity works for you. So this is a foundational issue that every parent is dealing with it, whether they actually hear it in the words, there is no truth or not, because it is the way that our culture functions. Think about the gender debate right now. How did we get to a place where a person can say, I am a woman in a man's body. I am in the wrong body. And their perceptions mentally be the arbitrator of what is true. How did we get there? 20 years ago, we would have said that can't ever happen. That's not even logical. And then not only that, our kids will then want to mutilate the physical body in reality to match the misperception. And they will be told by their teachers, if they are in a public school or any other school for that matter, many of them are influenced, even Christians become influenced by this way of thinking. And they will absorb this, that what is true is what my perceptions tell me. That is my truth. Now, we're not talking about, my experience is valuable, just like your experience is valuable. That's mutual respect. But we're talking about it's also true and valid. And so then it becomes, you get to choose whatever your way to what you call God is. All right, so now you can, based on the My Truth mantra, you can determine what God is yourself. You can create a smorgasbord in terms of religion. You can deconstruct the Christian faith, walk away. You can call yourself a Christian and yet not believe Jesus rose from the dead. That's where we are right now. That's exactly where we are. And this is the culture our kids are living in. This is the group of people from whom our kids will choose a spouse and raise our grandkids with. And some of us who are grandparents already are experiencing the pain of this reality because we didn't know this was happening for the past 20 years. And now we're blindsided. So we can still, it's not hopeless. God is still on his throne and we can get equipped. It'll take a little study. It'll take catching up. But we can do this, and we must do this for the sake of our children and our grandchildren and the heritage that we want to pass on.
So what is truth, and how do we know it exists?
Those are the two important questions that are most foundational. More foundational in terms of how we think than whether Christ rose from the dead and whether we know God exists. Not more important, more foundational in how we think. And we didn't talk about discussing this topic per se, but I'm headed to Michigan to do a conference this coming weekend where I'm going to talk about, is my truth true? And so I guess it's in the top of my mind, because until we decide what truth is, and then we know how we can know it exists, we can't argue that anything else is true. We can't say it's true that God exists. We can't say it's true that Jesus rose from the dead. If truth doesn't exist, those are irrelevant. And that's why we get nowhere in conversations with those that are much, much younger than us, because they're quite content that's true for you, but not for them. So what is truth? Just to give a quick synopsis, truth is what corresponds to reality, or a true statement is one that matches what's really the case. If I say that's a blue truck, it really is blue. Now, that doesn't tell us whether we can know all truths. It tells us what the nature of truth is. My perceptions as subject don't determine the truth. They recognize the truth. They either understand or misunderstand what's true. My perceptions don't determine the truth, therefore truth is not subjective. It's determined by the object about which I'm speaking. Okay? Then, how do I know it exists? To say truth does not exist assumes truth exists, because you're assuming that statement is true. It's self-defeating to say otherwise. So it cannot be debated that truth exists, but many people are quite content that's true for you and not for me, even when you show them that is self-refuting or self-defeating. And Hillary talks about this within her first apologetics book with Mama Bear Apologetics. I also talk about, I have a whole chapter on what truth is in my book called The Life Givers Apologetics. And it's a basic apologetics book just to introduce us as women to what apologetics is, why women are great Christian apologists, and what apologetics includes. What questions do we answer? Do we need to be able to answer as Christians for our kids and for ourselves within this culture, and to be able to talk to lost people nowadays? How do we talk to them? Because see, I could just say, the Bible says such and such. I could do a cold call at a house in the 80s back when we did visitation for church. And I could say the Bible says, and I didn't get an initial pushback on that because they still viewed the Bible as the good book. It was ultimate in some sense. This is not the case now. The Bible is a book of one religion among many books from many religions. It holds no more authority than anything else. And so we find ourselves in a place being questioned about how we can even know the Bible is true. And the answer, you just have to have faith, is not going to do it. Yes, you have to have faith, but that kind of concedes that Christianity is just something that you believe in spite of the evidence. And that's not correct. That's not what Christianity is, or that we claim. Christianity is supported by overwhelming evidence. In fact, as a Christian philosopher, if Christianity did not best explain reality, I would not be a Christian. I honestly believe, and I believe the evidence shows, that Christ's claims, and if he is who he said he was, and his resurrection is true, that best explains the nature of reality, the existence of truth, the problem of evil, the remedy for evil, and our future hope. So I really believe that the evidence shows that Christianity makes the most sense of everything we see and experience in this world. And we need to know that as Christians, because just have faith won't do it anymore.
Totally agree. It is so interesting you brought up how it used to be simple enough to just say the Bible says so. We don't live in that culture anymore. It's sad because I believe the Bible's the Word of God. I believe that it is the ultimate authority. I believe it is the good book, the only book I believe all of that, but most people don't. So it is just really sobering to realize we live in a time where we don't have the luxury as a parent to not dig into this with our children, because they will go out into society and culture, and if there's not substance to their faith and an understanding, it will cause problems. So when we're talking about,
we need to understand too, Elise, that this is for our own faith. I had a friend a few years ago who said, I read the Da Vinci Code and I wish I hadn't. It caused a lot of doubts. That tells me one thing. It tells me that she doesn't have the foundation to her faith that she needs to understand why she believes what she believes. Because when you understand why you believe it, then on the days where doubts arise, you know that your feelings will change. But you find that bedrock within understanding what truth is and what evidence best supports in terms of what we believe, what is reasonable, that is, to believe. And so it's for our own faith too.
Such a good point. And like much of what we do here at Raising Rock, we're building and we're creating for moms to share with their children. I find I get more value out of it sometimes than my kids do, because it'll cause me to really dig deep on a topic or really study what does the scripture say about this. And I end up being more blessed by the deep dive than even my kids are. So I think that's such a fitting thing to point out as moms and dads and grandparents and parents. This builds our faith while we're walking alongside building our children's faith. It's like kill two birds with one stone. So in talking about truth versus perception, I'm just thinking about practically going to my children, talking about those two words. And I feel like truth would be a much easier concept for them to grasp, because they're so used to language like, oh, you didn't tell the truth, or I told you the truth. That's a much more common word that a child would articulate. Perception is not as common. I don't know if I'd go to my 6-year-old and be like, I want to have a conversation about perception. That would register. So you have any practical ways that we can explain when we use that argument with our kids of truth versus perception, of how we can explain what perception is?
If we give our kids an example of something they thought was true, but they were wrong about, then that tells them that what they thought was true, what their feelings were, or their opinion about it can be wrong. And so I don't guess that we have to use the word perception, but what's in our mind about what is true about reality isn't always right. And that's why we check it. And that's why God gave us parents to help us who've had more experience evaluating claims critically. And we see kids all the time get into trouble or unsafe situations because they didn't understand the road, even though there's no vehicle on it right this minute. There can be in a moment, and that when it runs over you, it causes harm or death. So they misperceive. They misjudge things all the time. You can tell them not to touch the stove, it's hot. But they will reach out and touch it just to check and find that it burns and blisters their finger. Well, they misperceive something. So I don't think you have to use that word. We can say what we personally think about what is true, what we personally feel about what is true, what we wish were true doesn't make it true. And then we can give the example, any of our school-age kids who have taken a test and they didn't do so good because they really didn't study, they know that they don't feel good about their test result. So you can ask them, you made a bad grade on that, huh? Yeah? And it doesn't feel good to make a bad grade. No. But just because you feel bad about your grade, does that make it not true that you did fail the test? Those kinds of things where they're having to be put in the position of going, my feelings, okay, my desires, my wishes, and my opinions aren't always matching reality, what is true. Okay? Does that help?
That's like the practicality of what I'm looking for on these things, because I know I need those reminders of like how to practically go and then have these conversations with my children. So that's perfect. So I
try to integrate these into my normal day. So what happens, Elise, when you get some of these in your toolbox, they're sitting there. And we have devotionals with our grandsons. Yes, they have training times with me, and they know that that's how Nana is. They may not like it, but to get to do something else, they'll endure it, okay? But most of what we teach, we have to admit, is caught, not, it's in the teachable moment, right? So what you want is in your toolbox, sitting there ready and waiting. So when they come home with that bad grade, you're going, this is an opportunity. Buddy, when you made that bad grade on that test, you look like you're bummed about that. Yeah, and you wish you hadn't made it. What do you think could make a difference next time? Is there something you didn't understand, or maybe you just didn't give the time to it that you thought? What do you think is going to make that turn out differently next time? Oh, I don't know. Well, that's the usual. And we keep just working with them. But that's the opportunity to say, okay, I want you to understand something here. This is important, that you understand that what you feel about something, what you wish something was, doesn't make it true. The truth is you failed the test, and now there are consequences. So what we do is start here, and we move forward to change what happens next time. And you just move on now. You want to help me make dinner. And you're done. And these daily integrated teachable moments, taking advantage of those things, can only happen when we have the tools already in the toolbox. We can't be sitting there looking for a devotional to read. Okay? We have got to be studying for ourselves. Make sure we can understand something, explain it. I'm doing right now on Mama Bear Apologetics with Amy Davison a series of 20 episodes called The Top 20 Reasons We Can Know Christianity is True. I start with truth, then we go to it's true that God exists, it's true that miracles are possible, it's true that the New Testament's reliable, it's true that Jesus claimed and proved to be God, and then to the gospel. And I'm doing this in a series. And moms and grandmoms and granddads can listen or watch in and around their day while they're doing a bunch of other things, or once they're home from work, during their own downtime, maybe when they're taking a bath or in the bathroom putting on makeup. And I do a lot of that. I just punch something on that's going to be useful to me and keep my mind working, because I'm getting older and I want to be constantly stimulated. So these are things we can do to have the tools already in our toolbox that will be helpful to us just in the nick of time, I promise.
My favorite saying lately, and I've said it a bunch, so my audience is probably like, "Come on, Elise, we've heard that," is have 1,000 one-minute conversations. It is not this big sit-down conversation of what's truth and what's perception, although some children might need that. But more often than not, to your point, it's a tool that's in your tool belt, and you're pulling it out at random times, not because you had to run and get a devotional, but because it's just so ingrained in who you are that it seeps out into your parenting. It reminds me of the verse in Deuteronomy, and I need to memorize this verse because I think about it often, but it's the verse that says, talk about it when you're coming and going, when you sit and you stand. Do you know which verse I'm talking about?
When you rise up and when you lie down.
Yep. And the idea is, look for all these opportunities to talk to your children when you're coming and going, when you're rising and sitting, when you're laying down, like all these things. Those are all these in-between moments of life that you can pour into your children. And those in-between moments, that's where discipleship happens. That's where the work is done. It's rarely done in these big moments where let's sit down and talk. It more often just happens in the nooks and the crannies of your day when you least expect it. You're like, whoa, where did that come from? So I love your heart behind that, of filling our tool belt with these tools. Yes. So an 8 or 9-year-old comes up to mom and says, "Mom, I'm not sure if God really exists." Yeah. What does she do?
First thing we don't do is panic, especially if we've reared them in a Christian home. And you already know that I'm going to tell you, don't tell them you just have to have faith. Because Christianity does not require blind faith. There's plenty of evidence that God exists. There's far more evidence that he exists than that the natural world is all there is. So I actually had this conversation with my friend's granddaughter who happened to be visiting them, and had asked them this question, and they just asked me to talk to her. And we just sat down at the kitchen on our kitchen stools, and we started talking. And I had started by asking her some questions Acknowledging to them that is a good question that every single person needs to ask, and make sure they understand the answer. Because whenever we panic when our kids ask these questions and we want to go, I thought you already asked Jesus into your heart. They're not connecting all those dots, number one, how God exists as Jesus when they're very young. But also, they need to be able to question. We don't want them to question to the point that they stay in limbo forever. That's unhealthy, yeah. But to have questions about why they believe what they believe is critically important to their maturity. And whether we like it or not, at some point, they need to ask these questions for themselves, because they're never going to just imbibe mama and daddy's faith. They have to make it their own. Now, I trusted Christ when I was a very young child. I did it based on the authority and trustworthiness of my parents' witness. But my parents are not perfect. My parents' perceptions could be wrong. So I had to go through a period of time in my young adult years where the doubts just washed over me over and over. What if it's not true? What if it's not true? And fortunately, during those years, I could go to my pastor father. I asked him questions, but I also did research on my own. And this was during the years there was no cell phone, there was no computer, much less any Google and internet search. So I had to find real live hardback books, and I found them that were written by Christians who had asked these questions and come to some conclusions based on the evidence. So when I was talking to Steffi, I'll call her, when she was 8 years old at my friend's house in California, I talked to her and just asked her some questions like, what do you think caused the universe? Could it maybe have always been here? Or do you think it started at some point? Because we can talk to them about, yeah, scientists seem to think that it started. It had a beginning, but not just the universe. Time had a beginning. Space had a beginning. And all the stuff, matter, had a beginning. And so we began to talk about this. I asked her, I said, Steffi, do you think maybe that a human could have caused the universe? And she didn't think so. I said, could you have caused the sun, moon, and stars maybe? We talked about why that wasn't realistic as finite creatures. It was bigger and it was beyond us. I asked her if a cat maybe could cause the universe, and she got tickled about that and really laughed. I said, why not? Cats are really smart. Maybe a cat caused the universe. And we began to process this together, where we came to the conclusion that nothing inside of the universe could have caused the whole thing. Whatever caused it had to be outside of it and outside of all its rules and the way it worked, time, space, and matter. So if you have an older child, you can actually go into the beginning of time, space, and matter, and how Einstein's theory of general relativity shows that they all began at the same time. That would be for older kids. But I can start with an 8-year-old that, you remember, there was a point where there was nothing. Try to think about when the nothing is. You can't really think about it because there's nothing there. Okay, and then you start talking to them about maybe nothing caused the universe. Now, I have a friend who teaches biology in a public school, and she has said to me when I ask her, how in the world do you handle teaching biology in a public school when you can't mention God? She says, I talk to them about chance and how scientists argue that chance caused everything. It just happened, and it happened out of nothing, and then there was something. And she said, inevitably, they all stare back at me perplexed. Because we all know that in our experience there is nothing in the world, much less the world itself, that nothing can cause. Nothing comes from nothing. The only thing that can cause anything else must already exist. And we've already established it can't be something inside of the world. the space, the time that measures change, and the stuff in it. You can see with little kids, we can use our hand motions, okay? We can help them see, mentally put stuff in the universe, count time, and have the space in the universe. But whatever caused it must be outside of that. We call that being God. And you'll actually see Frank Turek in a question and answer at university. Some student come out and say, maybe it's just something that exists that's external to all of this. And Frank goes, yeah, we call that God. Because you can come to this conclusion without starting with the Bible. And Romans 1 promises us this. It says that we can know that God exists from creation through the things that are made. And the reason we can do that is because we are finite beings. We are physical, material, as well as immaterial, but material beings living in this physical world. And the way we come to know things is through our senses. We see them, we hear them, we smell them, we taste them, we touch them. And so through the effects, the things that God put here, we can know they had to be caused by something other than nothing, something other than a cat, something other than a human. It must be a being outside the universe who is the supreme, biggest intellect thinker, the biggest and strongest, most powerful being. And this being caused everything that exists because he already existed. And whenever then they ask, but then what caused God? We can talk about, we can't exist forever because we are made of stuff. But God is spirit. He is mind. So think about your thoughts. If you opened up your brain, you can't pull out your thoughts, right? So God is mind and thoughts, and he's not in a body. So he can exist apart from time, space, and matter, and we call that eternal, okay? And he exists because it's his nature to exist. And it's required that this kind of being exists for anything else that is limited and finite and dependent to exist at all. This kind of being has to exist. It's called a necessary being, a being that can't not exist.
I've never heard the explanation of you can't open your brain and pull out the thoughts. I think that's a really unique way to frame that up with our kids, because our kids would understand, I think, thoughts. And my kids are always like, I had a bad thought. I can't open up their brain and pull that thought out. And that's a really interesting way to speak to the difference of, we are humans, our bodies won't last forever, but thoughts are something that God is. I'm doing a bad job of regurgitating what you just said, but that was a light bulb click moment for me of a way to regurgitate that and explain that to our kids.
I think it's a big concept, though. We just stated a piece of it, didn't we? Because what we're talking about is the fact that humans are made of both material and immaterial aspects of being. And we can't say it like that, right? But we are. And we're made of stuff, but we're also made of mind, thoughts, desires, feelings, emotions. Now, we agree that the brain enables us to connect to the world and is our interface with the world, okay? And enables us to think. But our thoughts themselves, the concepts in our brain that we think about, are not material. So this is not an easy concept, and we've just touched on a corner of it. And if you ever want me to come back and discuss this a little bit more, this is a philosophical underpinning of everything, because then this leads into our discussion with our kids about what survives at death of our being, and what does it mean to be resurrected later. See? So all of that is in this notion of being both physical and spiritual, soul, mind, spirit, and being both material and immaterial, however you want to say it with your kids, whatever terms they're familiar with. This is a big thing, and it's quite deep. And so to even be able to articulate it in a way that our younger children can grasp some of it is important. This is one thing we need to remember, though. I asked one of my professors, how in the world do you explain the Trinity to kids? They're concrete. Until they're in that, 12 to 14 year age group, they're not able to think abstractly. And he said, go ahead and explain it correctly. Don't use the egg. Don't use all of he's a father.
Water, H2O.
These are all heresies. So he said it's better to explain it in an abstract way they can't understand, but for them to learn it. And then as they mature, they begin to grasp the meaning of it. Now, this is a principle I see in classical teaching, right? They spend in homeschools where they practice classical learning, they spend a lot of time in the younger years memorizing facts. And then the kids don't understand all those facts or the philosophical grounding for those facts. They just got them memorized. But then they're there for them to use when they begin to develop abstract thought. And then they begin to process and analyze them at a higher level. So we don't have to be able to perfectly make them understand things in a concrete way if it leads to error in our description. We can use analogies, but we have to be very careful because it's easy to go off in the ditch, isn't it? When we're explaining something like the Trinity and we end up explaining it in a way that's an error. And it would have been better to explain it, have them memorize it or learn it. You won't understand it yet, just memorize it. And then as they get older, help them to actually process and understand it.
You bring up an interesting point about understanding. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts on this. My son, the one that asks all the questions, that wants to really understand, believes, and will say he believes, and I believe it. He does. I see his heart believes in God and believes that Jesus died on the cross for his sins, but he gets hung up on not understanding and thinks that I think he almost holds it against himself or fears that because he doesn't understand it fully, that it doesn't count. I don't know. Does that, I think that would probably be an accurate way of saying it, because he doesn't understand it fully. He can't understand the Trinity fully. He can't understand Jesus raising from the dead and how that happened, because he can't understand it fully, that it somehow discredits the fact that he has faith that it happened. And okay. I always say the verse to him. I think it's in Mark. I had it pulled up. Mark 9:24. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And that it's just this life. I try to explain to him, your entire life is a sanctification process. And I do use that word with him. I'm trying to help him understand this. I'm like, but your entire life, you're being sanctified. You don't have to understand this fully ever this side of heaven. I think that's part of it, is we can't understand all these concepts fully this side of heaven. We will have so much answered when we see the fullness of his glory and all of this is revealed to us. We can understand apologetics. We can do our best to put the facts together and all of that. That will help us. But what would you say to a child who's saying, I believe, but I don't understand, and I'm fearful that might discredit my faith?
Yes. Welcome to my world as an adult.
I say the same thing. I'm like, I struggle too. We all do. We all struggle with doubts at times. That's part of the experience.
This is one reassuring thought. Why should we think that we understand everything fully as finite, let's see, you would say limited human beings, about an infinite God? If we could understand fully everything about God, we would be God. We are not infinite. So there are limitations to our understanding, but that's not the end of the story, okay? There's still good news. Because, as we said in Romans 1, Jesus, God in the flesh, has implanted in the creation enough evidence for us to know that he exists, to know his divine qualities. Then we can be so sure of those that when he tells us something that requires a special revelation, like the Trinity, the incarnation, we know we can trust him in what we can't fully understand because of what he's given us to understand in the creation that we can see.
I love that.
Okay. Now,
I love
this
that.
is
It's
the
so
thing.
practical.
Remind your child this, Elise. There are things that mommy tells you and explains fully to you. If you ask, Mommy, why can't I eat that extra ice cream tonight? What I have found is that extra ice cream sometimes makes the tummy hurt, and it may be the stuff in the ice cream, and because too much sugar isn't good for us, and it makes our tummy hurt. Sometimes you even throw up. And I have explained that to you, and now when you ask for that extra ice cream, you know that when I tell you that, I'm not doing it to keep you from having fun, but I don't want your tummy to hurt. And I know more than you because I'm more experienced than you. So I'm going to protect you and help you make that decision till you're old enough to make it on your own. Okay? So there are times I give you explanations like that, right? And they'll agree with you. Yeah, okay. But there are times I will tell you something and I will say I will have to explain it more later. It may be that you have a young child who notices someone who looks like a female but says they are male. Okay? And there may be other bigger things. You can think of something for them that you say, you were just going to have to trust me right now. And Corrie ten Boom talked about this. I remember reading it in The Hiding Place years and years ago. I hope I don't misstate it. But that she asked something about sex or something that would be a deeper topic. And her daddy asked her to pick up a heavy suitcase and she couldn't. And he explained to her, sweetheart, just as it's too heavy for you to pick up right now, so it's talking about this too heavy for you to carry right now. There will come a time when you get older, when you can pick it up and understand it better. So there's both and. Times I do explain and times I don't explain. So sometimes you have to take things on faith. And faith isn't blind. Why? Because your son or a daughter has come to know they can trust you because of the evidence you have provided, the reasons you have given. So now they know, since they can trust you in that, when you tell them something they're not ready for or can't fully grasp, they can trust that you're telling the truth because of this evidence. And this is the same with God. He has implanted evidence in the order, the design, the anthropic principle, the fine-tuning argument, specified complexity, irreducible complexity. I'm just throwing out scientific principles, okay? He's given all of this to us to show us. I would have to slap you in the head to make you know I exist. And I just did. I've given you all this. The information in DNA, that I am here, that I am the cause. Look up at the sky. The heavens declare my glory. I've given you all this evidence to know that I exist. Now, I'm going to reveal something to you in my word that you won't yet be able to see. And the scriptures say that even in Abraham and many of those faith heroes believed God and died before they saw the fulfillment of their faith. They believed God for it. They believed God was going to provide that ultimate sacrifice. They didn't fully understand it was Jesus. And so it is with us, sweetheart. Sometimes God's going to show us things that are true, but we can't fully understand how they're true because we're limited humans or because we can't understand them yet. And we need to grow up more because our brains aren't fully developed. And even when they are, we still learn things. Even like Nana, who's 70, she's still learning things that are new about God. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Absolutely, it helps. What are some what are some pieces of evidence that would be comprehensible to a child that would prove Jesus died and resurrected?
Okay. I think that they can understand most of the things that we talk about with adults, just maybe in different phrasing a little bit. One of the things that we can help them understand that Jesus didn't just appear in the New Testament. Most kids have trouble wanting and enjoying and appreciating the Old Testament. Most adults do too, don't we?
I will say the last couple years, I've been digging into the Old Testament through the Bible recap.
Yes.
I don't know. I love the Old Testament. I wouldn't have said that until I actually went in and studied it and read it. But oh my word, the Old Testament is amazing. The stories are amazing, and Jesus is all over it. Like if you look for Jesus, he is all over the Old Testament. Like, I just get so passionate talking about the Old Testament. I'm like, it's the best. It's so good.
Yes, it's vital, because while we don't follow some of the types of laws that were pertaining to their culture and time as a theocracy, God's word is eternal, and so the moral commands are eternal. And all of the 10 commandments are absorbed then in the 2 greatest commandments that Jesus talked about. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And so he repeats this, and he tells them in Luke 24:44 that the entire Old Testament was written about him. He tells them that the Torah, the law, was written about him. The prophets, both major and minor, were written about him, and the writings, of which Psalms was the flagship book. And so he tells them the entire Old Testament was written about him. And then on the road to Emmaus, remember, he begins to explain, beginning with Moses. What did he begin with? To explain to them who he was. He began with the law. He began with the sacrifices. He began with the festivals and explained how they all revealed him. So Jesus didn't just appear on the scene in the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He pre-existed that. The New Testament says that, and the Old Testament points to it. So they can understand prophecies that were written. And we don't have to use the word prophecy. We can say that people called prophets lived many hundreds of years before and talked about this one who was going to come, called Messiah or the Christ, and what he was going to be like. And then we can show them in the Old Testament the prophecies about how he was going to be sinless, how he was going to do miracles, how he was going to die by piercing, where he was going to be born. And then in Isaiah 53, that he was going to die and he was going to rise again, because it says that he was going to die, and then that he was going to die on behalf of trespassers. So there's the substitutionary atonement. And that he was going to see his descendants, and God was going to prolong his days after his death. So we can go to Isaiah 53 and ask our kids to help us find where Jesus' resurrection is pointed to. And ask them to find in Isaiah 53 all the things that it talks about that happened to Jesus of Nazareth. And they will be able to list them. Once they're able to read, they'll be able to list them. Even before that, you can read them out in an easy-to-read version, and they will be able to recognize these are prophecies. So the very fact that it was predicted in the Old Testament that Messiah was going to die and rise again, whoever is Messiah, this is going to happen to. Then second prediction, Jesus himself predicted at least 3 times in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that he was going to die, at the hands of whom he was going to die, and also that he was going to rise again on the 3rd day. So he predicted it. And then talk to them about what predicted it means. If someone said about you, like they put information in a time capsule 100 years before you were ever born, and they bury this little time capsule, say it's a little box with all this information, and they stuck it in to the ground and buried it. And then you dug it up one day, and it has your name, it has who your first puppy dog is going to be, it lists your favorite toothpaste, your favorite candy, how tall you were going to be when you grew up, and you find out yet later that you ended up being that tall, whether you're going to have freckles or not, all these details about you, but they wrote it 100 years before you were even born. What would you think about that? Do you think that God might have something to do with that? So they can begin to understand the gravity of what we're saying when we use the word prophecy, that it was foretold. They memorize these stories and they know they're true. That Micah said that Messiah was going to be born in Bethlehem. There are 2 Bethlehems, one in north, one in south of Israel. How do we know which one? Because it's Bethlehem Ephrathah in Judah. That's how specific it was, a town with a mere few thousand people. When we begin to explain this to them and maybe have them understand the time capsule thing, because a lot of them, like in school, they read about people doing time capsules. You might even pull up a story about that, what was put into a time capsule that was later opened up 100 years later. And so there are examples of that might be helpful to them. But that this person actually knew all the correct details about your life, things that no one could have known. This is what Isaiah did. This is what David did in Psalm 22 when he announced about Jesus and that he was going to be pierced, but that he was also going to rise again. Isaiah wrote that 700 years before Jesus was ever born on earth. How did he do that, do you think? So that's one of the ways. So the prediction aspect is very helpful for kids to understand, and also understand that Jesus didn't just appear. He pre-existed. Before his coming to earth, he was already the Son of God and existed. And then the empty tomb has to be dealt with. The tomb was empty, and the enemies of Jesus never produced a body. That's all they had to do to shut everyone up, is to produce a body, and they never did. And we know that he died. We know that he was buried. There are people outside of the New Testament who wrote shortly after the time of Christ, like Josephus and others, who wrote about Jesus dying under the hands and execution command of Pilate. So this is verified by history, both within the Bible, but also outside of the Bible. As your kids get older, read to them sections from Josephus. Read to them what Tacitus said less than 100 years after Jesus, that Nero persecuted Christians and killed them and tortured them because of what they believed. What made these Christians willing to die for this claim that Jesus rose from the dead? Because it had been passed down to them from eyewitnesses who actually saw him. And we're not talking about a ghostly appearance. We're saying he talked with them. He sat down and ate food with them. His body was physical. He invited Thomas to touch his scars where the imprints of the nails had been and the side where the spear had pierced him. So he was in the same physical body, but it was changed somehow. And the eyewitnesses tell the accounts of this. We have to ask ourselves, why were these eyewitness disciples who were hiding in a locked room because they were afraid of the Jews, that the Jews would do the same thing to them that they had done to Jesus, scared and afraid? Why did they change? And less than 2 months later, they're willing to die for the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Many other messiahs who claimed to be Messiah lived and died during the time of Jesus and shortly thereafter. Their movements died out. They disappeared when they died. This was what was about to happen to this religious sect called Christianity. But then something happened that changed their minds and their courage from fearful to bold, willing to go as martyrs to the death. Further, it convinced not only people who were believers and could be said so-called to be biased, but it convinced skeptics such as Jesus' half-brother James. James in John chapter 7 doesn't believe anything about Jesus. He's just his brother. He's nothing more. By the time he writes James chapter 1 verse 1, he is the bondservant of the Lord Jesus Christ. And in that name and those titles, he is saying that Jesus, his brother, is the anointed one, the Christ, Hebrew Messiah, and he is Lord, not Caesar. Remember, Caesar often required the people to say that he was divine. But he says Jesus is the Lord Jesus Christ and that he is his servant. What could possibly change him from a skeptic to a radical believer? It was the resurrection. And the movement went on. And the only way it could have is because these people really saw him risen after the dead. And Pliny the Younger, in the early 200s, writes, now remember, I'm talking about in the early 2nd century, within maybe 50 years of John the Apostle living, Pliny the Younger, who is not a Christian, writes that these people called Christians worshiped Jesus as God. So don't let anyone tell you that Jesus became God in the minds of people much later, such as Constantine. Not true. We have historical witness that the Christians from the beginning believed he was God. Why would they believe he was God? Because he had the power to predict and accomplish his own resurrection. And our kids can understand every one of those if we take them perhaps in bites, especially the younger kids, one bite in one setting. But we have a whole series of evidences, from the eyewitness to the enemies in the empty tomb, to the conversion of skeptics, to the movement surviving Jesus, to their change of heart from fearful to bold and courageous. So these are the evidences I would share with my kids. And in fact, I did. My boys, 4 grandsons that live near us, we sat down right before Easter and I asked them, because several of them have trusted Jesus as Savior and been baptized, why they believe Jesus really rose from the dead. So I asked them, and they answered. Some of them answered quite astutely because they are in a good school and have parents who teach them, and I reinforce where I can. But they can understand these evidences as well as an adult because they are physical. We're not saying that there was a ghostly apparition and that it was floating in the air. We're saying he lived, he walked, he ate, and he talked with them and had invited them to touch him. He was real and he was physical. It was the same body he died in, but it had been transformed so that now it would die nevermore. And this is important, Elise, because we need to understand that Philippians 3 promises that whatever happened to Jesus' body in the resurrection is going to happen to us too. That's what our body's going to be like. Physical but glorified is the word we use, but changed so that it doesn't have pain and the limitations of the human body that we're in right now. And that's exciting.
So exciting. You mentioned several different resources. So for the mom listening that is like, I want more of this, we could go on, and I have so many more questions for you, but maybe I'll save that for round 2, which you did hint that you'd be willing to come back. So yes. I will take advantage of that. But where can moms find more of your content, more of Mama Bear Apologetics, your book, the Mama Bear Apologetics books? Just kind of tell us really quickly where we can find more if that's of interest.
Go for the books, Mama Bear Apologetics, and my book, Life Givers Apologetics, that has chapters specifically on the resurrection. Every evidence I just mentioned is in my book because mine is a foundational apologetics book. Hillary's book, Mama Bear Apologetics, is culturally oriented. And so it takes the foundational truths that I'm teaching and applies them to cultural claims that are deceptions our kids need to understand. So Mama Bear Apologetics, Life Givers Apologetics, both on Amazon.com. And then I would encourage them to go to Mama Bear Apologetics, and my website is Dr. Nana Talks Faith. Check out the resources and especially the podcast. If you're, say, a Nana Bear and you're a little nervous about digging into a book or you don't like to read, then the podcast is great because our podcasts are less than an hour long, 30 to 45 minutes usually. And I've got that top 20 series where Amy and I are recording. We're about to number 8 or 9 right now. The next episode we're recording tomorrow is on evil, how God can exist and evil can exist. Big question, right? So
Huge
we deal with
question.
all of these. Yeah, and we deal with them in every segment of these. At the end, we talk about how do we talk to our kids about this. It's not just facts that we're throwing at you. We want to know, how do we translate this into usable truth that our kids can take hold of, digest, and live out and test in the real life situation of every day. So we're committed to teaching moms and grandmoms and granddads and dads how to teach our kids these truths, not just to absorb them ourselves, how to integrate them, how to do it with younger kids, how to do it with older kids. We're always learning new things. I'm learning from my grandsons all the time. I didn't have all this. When my girls were growing up, they didn't benefit from all this. I hadn't gone back to seminary yet. And so whenever I learned all of this, and it began to answer my but what about questions and so many of doubts, and gave me a framework that I could kind of hook the truths on and make them fit in this big picture. They weren't just random. I began to understand and had so many aha moments that I just became determined, Lord, help me every bit of this education I get to be able to use it, not to become more academic, but to be able to put it in the hands of people, other Christians who want this, but it seems a little highbrow or too academic for them. Help me do that. So that's what I'm working on all the time.
Thank you for doing that, because it is so practical and helpful for the moms out here who want to regurgitate this, want the information first ourselves, but then want a way to regurgitate back to our children. So that work is so valuable, and we're just so thankful. I end every episode with this question. At Raising Rock, we have 4 core values, which are respect, obedience, courage, and kindness. The values that I hope to first have myself and then be able to pass on as character into my children. Which of those values jumps out at you, and why? And how can you encourage a mom listening today to fight the good fight and instilling that character into her children?
Right now, we need courage. We have shut down and shut up as Christians in this culture. What these truths that I'm sharing with you do for us as Christians is give us the ability to stand, not to be defensive, but to provide reasons to explain why we believe what we believe to people who are lost, to our children, and in response to our own doubts. And so we need courage to take what we're absorbing and understanding and try it out. And we need courage to understand that not everyone will respond. Even maybe most won't respond in a positive way. We need to take courage when we're called names because we disagree. But once we know the truth, when we disagree and we don't get a positive response, then we know why we believe what we believe and we're not shaken. And that's what we want for our kids. So courage, I think, is what we need in this culture. Courage to try to learn these new truths that seem foreign to us who are a little bit older, especially like me. Courage to take these truths and speak them out, learn how to articulate them even when we feel clumsy. And courage to stand in love and firmness in the face of opposition before a lost and dying world and a political environment that defines tolerance as affirmation of everything I say as true. That's why we need courage.
Wow. Let's end it with wow, because that was such a great answer to that question. Tricia, thank you so much for joining us today. Mm-hmm. I will take you up on round 2. So our audience, be watching for round 2 with Tricia, and I can't wait to dig in more.